Catherall had been a young lieutenant when they assigned him to Chicago. He was 23 years old in Valkyrie years, which meant he was barely an adult. He had graduated from the military academy with high marks. His instructor said he had a promising future. They sent him to Earth because they believed the war would be over quickly. They wanted him to gain easy experience before moving on to more important assignments. Chicago was supposed to be a simple posting. The Valkyrie had driven the human military out of the city in the first month of the invasion. They had established a forward base in the downtown area, in the shadows of the tall buildings that the humans had built. The streets were empty. The civilians had fled. Valkyrie Command declared the city pacified and moved on to other targets. Catherall was given command of a 12-block sector with 200 soldiers under him. His orders were simple. Hold the territory. Maintain security. Report any unusual activity. For the first 3 days, nothing happened. His soldiers patrolled the empty streets. They searched the abandoned buildings. They found nothing but dust and silence. Catherall began to relax. He wrote letters home to his family, telling them that the war was going well and that he would return soon. On the fourth night, the attacks began. The first sign was the disappearance of a patrol. 8 soldiers had gone out to check the perimeter. They never came back. Catherall sent another team to search for them. They found the bodies in an alley, stripped of their weapons and equipment. Their throats had been cut. There was no sign of the attackers' dot over the next week. Catherall lost 31 soldiers. They were killed in ones and twos, picked off during patrols, or ambushed in buildings they thought they had secured. The attacks never came from the same direction twice. The humans seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Catherall reported the situation to his superiors. They told him to deal with it. They said a small group of human stragglers was nothing to worry about. They refused to send reinforcements. The humans were not stragglers. Catherall realized this when his soldiers captured a wounded human fighter during a raid on one of their hidden positions. The prisoner was a woman named Maggie Dunn. She was young, maybe 25 years old, with short dark hair and cold eyes. Her uniform identified her as a corporal in the human army. Catherall tried to interrogate her. He asked how many fighters were in her group. He asked where their base was located. He asked who was leading them. Maggie Dunn said nothing. She just stared at him with those cold eyes and smiled. They put her in a holding cell. That night, 3 of Catherall's soldiers were killed by sniper fire. The shots came from a building that his patrols had cleared just hours before. The range was almost 2,000 meters, far beyond what Valkyrie intelligence said human weapons could achieve. In the morning, they found that Maggie Dunn had escaped from her cell. The guards were dead. The lock had been picked with a piece of wire. Over the next 3 weeks, Maggie Dunn killed 17 Valkyrie officers. She never fired from the same position twice. She never left any trace that could lead them to her. Catherall's soldiers began to panic. They refused to go near windows. They flinched at every shadow. Catherall requested thermal imaging equipment from command. They sent it. His soldiers used the technology to scan every building in their sector, looking for heat signatures that would reveal human hiding spots. The humans adapted. They covered themselves with mud and sewage from the city's drainage system. The filth masked their body heat. They became invisible again. Catherall ordered his soldiers to seal the tunnel entrances that led into the underground. The humans had been using the subway system and the old sewer networks to move unseen beneath the streets. His engineers worked for 2 days, filling the tunnels with rubble and welding metal plates over the access points. It didn't matter. The humans dug new tunnels. They broke through basement walls. They created passages that connected the buildings above ground. They were like water, flowing around every obstacle and finding new paths forward. By the end of the second month, Cathral's unit had been reduced from 200 soldiers to 31. They had killed perhaps 15 humans in return. Maybe 20. He wasn't sure anymore. The bodies disappeared before they could be counted. The worst part was the fear. Cathral's soldiers stopped sleeping. They jumped at every sound. Some of them began to see humans everywhere, in every shadow and every movement. A few went mad and had to be restrained. Cathral himself could not escape the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he walked through the streets, every time he stood near a window, he felt eyes on him. He knew that somewhere out there, Maggie Dunn was looking at him through her scope. He knew that at any moment, she could end his life with a single bullet. The only reason he was still alive was because she had decided not to kill him yet. He requested orbital bombardment. He begged command to destroy the city from space and end the nightmare. They refused. They said it would be wasteful to use such resources against a small resistance force. They said he was exaggerating the threat. They said he needed to control his fear and do his duty. Cathral stopped reporting the casualties. He stopped reporting anything at all. He just tried to keep his remaining soldiers alive for one more day. Near the end of his assignment in Chicago, a young private came to him with a question. The private was terrified, barely able to speak. He asked Cathral how the humans could fight like this. How could so few people cause so much damage? Cathral thought about the question for a long time. Because we are not fighting a few people, he finally answered. We are fighting all of them, every human on this planet. The soldiers, the civilians, the old and the young. They have all decided that we are their enemy. And every single one of them is willing to die if it means killing even one of us. He looked at the young private with exhausted eyes. There is no small force. There is no isolated resistance. Every human is the resistance. And they will never stop until we are dead or gone. 3 days later, Cathral was transferred out of Chicago. He was one of 11 survivors from his original unit of 200. He left behind a city that the Velthari had conquered and occupied, but never truly controlled. The humans remained in the shadows, waiting for the next group of soldiers to arrive. Cathral thought Chicago was the worst thing he would ever experience. He was wrong. His next assignment would take him to a place that made Chicago seem like a peaceful dream. It was a mountain range in western North America. The humans called it the Rockies. And that was where he would meet Danny Ortiz for the first time. The Rocky Mountains were supposed to be safe. That was what Cathral's commanders told him when they gave him his new assignment. The Velthari had built a massive supply depot in a valley deep in the mountain range. It was far from the human population centers. The terrain was harsh and difficult to navigate. The weather was brutal, with freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall for most of the year. The commanders believed that no human force could survive in such conditions long enough to threaten the depot. They were confident that the mountains themselves would protect the base. Cathral arrived at the depot in the early winter. He was given command of a defensive section, a promotion that came from surviving Chicago when so many others had died. He tried to feel grateful, but all he felt was tired. The war had only been going on for 6 months, and already he felt like an old man. The depot held enough weapons, ammunition, and supplies to support the entire North American campaign for a year. There were 3,000 Velthari soldiers stationed there. The base had heavy defensive walls, automated weapon systems, and constant air patrols. It seemed like a fortress that nothing could threaten. On his first night at the depot, Cathral stood outside and looked at the mountains rising around him. The peaks were covered in snow, white and silent against the dark sky. The air was thin and cold. His lungs struggled to work properly at this altitude, and his scales could not regulate his body temperature well in the freezing conditions. A senior officer came to stand beside him. The officer had been stationed at the depot for 3 months already. Beautiful, isn't it? the officer said, looking at the mountains. It's cold, Kethrol replied. How do you survive here? The officer laughed bitterly. We stay inside. We use heaters and protective gear. We limit our time outdoors. If we follow the protocols, we can function well enough. He paused, and his expression became serious. The humans don't have protocols. They don't use heaters. They walk through this terrain like they were born in it. I've seen them move through blizzards that would kill any of us in minutes. They don't seem to feel the cold at all. Kethrol felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There are humans here? He asked. The officer nodded slowly. A small unit. Army Rangers, they call themselves. They've been raiding our supply convoys for 2 months. We've tried to hunt them down, but they know these mountains better than we ever will. They disappear into the snow and the rocks, and we never find them. He looked at Kethrol with tired eyes. Their leader is a sergeant named Danny Ortiz. Remember that name. If you're lucky, you'll never meet him. Kethrol met Danny Ortiz 3 weeks later. The attack came on a night when the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The wind was howling through the valley, carrying sheets of snow that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The automated sensors were useless in the storm. The patrols had been called back to shelter. The Velthari thought they were safe. No one could be outside in such conditions. No one could move, let alone fight. They were wrong. The first sign of the attack was an explosion at the main ammunition storage building. The blast lit up the night like a second sun and sent shock waves rolling across the base. Before the Velthari could react, more explosions followed. The fuel depot, the vehicle maintenance bay, the communications tower. Kethrol grabbed his weapon and ran outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He could barely breathe. His scales began to crack from the frost. Through the swirling snow, he saw them. Dark shapes moving between the buildings, firing precise shots and throwing grenades. There were maybe 20 of them, wrapped in white camouflage that made them almost invisible against the snow. They moved like ghosts. They fought like demons. Kethrol tried to organize a defense, but his soldiers were scattered and confused. The storm made communication impossible. The explosions had destroyed the base's coordination systems. Each group of Velthari was fighting alone, unable to see or contact the others. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 43 Velthari were dead. A month's worth of ammunition had been destroyed. The fuel depot was burning, and the humans had vanished back into the mountains without losing a single fighter. Kethrol stood in the ruins of the ammunition building as dawn broke over the mountains. His body was shaking from cold and exhaustion. His commanding officer came to stand beside him. That was Ortiz, the commander said quietly. He's been doing this for 4 months. Small raids, always at night, always when the weather is worst. He never loses anyone. We never catch him. How is this possible? Kethrol asked. How can they survive out there? How can they fight in these conditions? The commander had no answer. Over the following weeks, the raids continued. The Velthari reinforced their defenses. They increased patrols. They brought in more soldiers. None of it mattered. One night, Ortiz's team infiltrated the base again and destroyed the replacement communications equipment that had just arrived. Another night, they poisoned the water supply, forcing the entire garrison to rely on emergency rations for a week. The Velthari finally managed to wound and capture one of Ortiz's soldiers during a raid. He was a young private named Kyle Vance, barely 19 years old. He had been shot twice in the chest and once in the leg. By all logic, he should have been dead. They brought him to the medical bay and tried to save his life so they could interrogate him. The Velthari doctors worked for hours to repair the damage to his body. When Kyle Vance woke up, Kethrol was waiting for him. Tell me about your unit, Kethrol said. Tell me where your base is. Tell me how many of you there are." Kyle Vance looked at him with glassy eyes. Blood was still seeping through his bandages. He should have been terrified. He should have been desperate to save his own life. Instead, he smiled. "My name is Kyle Vance," he said. "Private First Class. Serial number 4-7-2-9-6-1-8-3. Cathro pressed him harder. He threatened him with pain. He promised him medical treatment if he cooperated. He offered him a chance to survive. Kyle Vance just kept smiling. He repeated his name, his rank, and his serial number. Nothing else done. An hour later, Kyle Vance died from his wounds. He died singing a song in a weak, fading voice. Kethril did not understand the words, but years later, he learned what the song was. The humans called it their national anthem. It was about a flag that survived a battle and kept flying through the night. Kyle Vance died singing about his flag and smiling at his enemies. Kethril learned a human word that winter. The word was spite. It meant to do something harmful or unpleasant to someone else, not because you would benefit from it, but simply because you wanted them to suffer. The humans fought with spite. They did not fight to win, because they knew they could not win. They fought to make losing cost to Velthury everything they had. They fought to make sure that every victory came with a price paid in blood and fire and grief. Kethril was beginning to understand why the Velthury had made a terrible mistake coming to Earth. The High Command was beginning to understand it too. They decided to take a new approach. They would break the humans the way they had broken every other species that resisted. They called it the Decimation Protocol. It had worked on 37 worlds. On Earth, it would prove to be the greatest mistake the Velthury ever made. The Decimation Protocol was simple. For every Velthury soldier killed by human resistance forces, 10 human civilians would be executed publicly. The killings would be broadcast across all communication channels. The message would be clear. Stop fighting or watch your people die. The Velthury High Command believed this would break the humans' will to resist. It had worked on 37 other worlds. When faced with the choice between continued resistance and mass civilian deaths, every other species had eventually surrendered. Their people had turned against their own fighters, demanding that they stop the violence. The resistance had crumbled from within. Velthury expected the same thing to happen on Earth. Kethril was transferred from the mountain depot to an occupation zone in a region called Ohio. His new assignment was to participate in the Decimation Protocol. He was ordered to help select and execute civilians in response to resistance attacks. He hated the assignment. He hated what he was being asked to do. But he was a soldier, and he followed orders. The first execution took place in a small town that had been the site of a resistance bombing. 12 Velthury soldiers had been killed when a truck filled with explosives was driven into their barracks. Under the protocol, 120 civilians would be selected for execution. Kethril was part of the selection team. They went through the town's population records and chose their victims at random. Old and young, men and women, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers. None of them had anything to do with the bombing. That was the point. The punishment was meant to be indiscriminate. The civilians were gathered in the town's main square. They were forced to kneel in rows, facing a wall. Velthury soldiers stood behind them with weapons ready. The humans did not beg. They did not cry. They did not plead for mercy. They were silent. They looked at their executioners with eyes full of hatred and defiance. Some of them held hands with the person next to them. Some of them whispered prayers. Some of them just stared straight ahead, refusing to give the Velthury the satisfaction of seeing their fear. Kethril remembered one man in particular. He was old, maybe 70 years in human age. His hair was white and his hands were weathered from years of hard work. His name was Henry Marsh, and he had been a farmer all his life. He had 3 grandchildren. He had never held a weapon. When the soldiers came to line him up for execution, Henry Marsh did not resist. He walked calmly to his place in the row. He knelt when he was told to kneel, but before the shooting started, he turned his head and looked at the crowd of humans who had been forced to watch. His voice was clear and strong. "Make them pay for every one of us," he said. "Every single one." Then he turned back to face the wall and waited for the bullet. Catherall gave the order to fire. 120 people died in that square. Their bodies were left where they fell as a warning to others. The Velthri expected the surviving humans to turn on the resistance. They expected them to demand peace. They expected the cycle of violence to end. Instead, something else happened. That night, the resistance cell in Ohio launched the largest attack in the region's history. They struck the Velthri regional headquarters with overwhelming force. They used everything they had: guns, explosives, improvised weapons, and their own bare hands. They fought for 6 hours without stopping. When dawn came, more than 300 Velthri soldiers were dead. The headquarters was a burning ruin. The human fighters had taken heavy losses too, but they had won. The leader of the attack was a young woman named Amy Marsh. She was Henry Marsh's granddaughter. She had watched him die in the square, and she had decided to answer his final request. Reports came in from across the planet. Everywhere the decimation protocol was implemented, the same pattern emerged. Instead of breaking the humans' will, the execution strengthened it. Recruitment for resistance forces tripled overnight. People who had been neutral or passive suddenly volunteered to fight. Farmers picked up guns. Teachers made bombs. Children carried messages for the fighters. The humans had a phrase for what was happening. They called it blood debt. Every civilian killed by the Velthri was a debt that had to be repaid, and the humans intended to collect that debt with interest. Catherall watched as the war changed around him. The Velthri had expected to crush the resistance with terror. Instead, they had given the humans a reason to fight that went beyond simple survival. Every execution created new enemies. Every massacre produced new fighters. The harder the Velthri pushed, the harder the humans pushed back. Something else changed too. The Velthri soldiers began to feel something they had never experienced before. They began to feel fear. Soldiers refused deployment orders. They claimed illness or injury to avoid being sent to combat zones. Officers requested transfers to other warfronts, anywhere that was not Earth. Morale collapsed. Discipline broke down. Catherall saw it in his own unit. His soldiers jumped at shadows. They could not sleep. They flinched at every sudden noise. They had nightmares about human faces, human voices, human hands coming out of the darkness to kill them. One night, Catherall was summoned to a meeting with his commanding officer. The officer looked exhausted. His scales were pale and his eyes were hollow. "I've received word from High Command," the officer said. "Admiral Tethfer has proposed a new strategy. He wants to bombard the planet from orbit, glass the entire surface, kill every human, and start over with a dead world." Catherall felt sick to his stomach. He thought of the millions of humans who had nothing to do with the fighting. The children, the elderly, the innocent. What did High Command say? He asked. The officer shook his head slowly. They refused. Not because they care about human lives. They want Earth's resources. They think they can still win this war if we just try harder. He laughed bitterly. They don't understand. This war is already lost. We lost it the moment we decided to use the decimation protocol. We thought we could break them with fear. Instead, we just gave them permission to hate us without limits. Catherall returned to his quarters that night and sat alone in the darkness. He thought about the old farmer who had looked death in the face and told his people to take revenge. He thought about the granddaughter who had answered that call. He thought about all the dead on both sides and all the death still to come. He understood something that night. The Valkyrie had made a mistake that could never be undone. They had turned the war from a conquest into something personal. Every human on Earth now had a personal reason to fight. A brother killed in an execution. A mother shot in a raid. A grandfather murdered in a town square. 8 billion humans. 8 billion personal grudges. 8 billion reasons to never stop fighting. Catherall had been taught that war was about strategy and resources and territory. The humans had taught him that war could be about something else entirely. It could be about hatred. It could be about revenge. It could be about making sure that even if you lost, your enemy would never truly win. The Valkyrie were about to learn that lesson in Blood Dot in year 2 of the war. The humans launched their first major counteroffensive. They had spent the first year bleeding the Valkyrie slowly, grinding them down, wearing them out. Now they were ready to strike back, and Catherall would meet Danny Ortiz one final time. The lights in the assembly hall dimmed further as Kriegstall prepared to share his next story. He could see the cadets shifting in their seats, some of them clearly wanting to leave, but too disciplined to move. He understood their discomfort. These were not the stories they had expected to hear. These were not tales of glory and triumph, but they were true. And truth was more important than comfort. I have told you about human courage and human persistence, Kriegstall said. Now I must tell you about something else. Something that even I struggle to understand, even after all these years. The hologram flickered back to life, showing a stellar map of the frontier region. A red dot pulsed in an asteroid field near the edge of Coalition space. The 5th year of the war was the darkest time for the Coalition. The Drexar had pushed us back on every front. Our supply lines were broken. Our fleets were scattered. Many believed the war was already lost. He pointed to the red dot. Intelligence discovered that the Drexar had hidden a command vessel in this asteroid field. This ship controlled all communications for 3 sectors. If it was destroyed, the enemy would be blind and confused for months. It could change the entire course of the war. The hologram zoomed in to show a massive alien warship surrounded by spinning rocks. It was heavily armored and protected by dozens of smaller vessels. The problem was simple. The asteroid field was too dense for large fleet movements. Any attacking force would be torn apart before reaching the target. And even if a ship got through, the Drexar reinforcements would arrive before any rescue could be mounted. Kriegstall's voice grew heavy. Coalition Command called it a suicide mission. They looked for volunteers, but made it clear that whoever went would not be coming back. Most commanders refused to even consider it. The price was too high. The hologram shifted to show a human destroyer, sleek and silver against the black of space. Letters on its hull spelled out a name in the human language. The Valiant Sun, a destroyer-class vessel with a crew of 112. Their captain was a woman named Louise Grant. An image appeared of a human female in her middle years, with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through the hologram into the souls of everyone watching. There was no softness in her face. She looked like someone who had seen too much and carried it all inside her. Captain Grant had been fighting since the first day of the war. She had lost 2 ships before the Valiant Sun. She had watched friends die in numbers that would break most beings. But she had never stopped fighting, never stopped believing that victory was possible. Kriegstall paused and took a slow breath. When Grant heard about the mission, she volunteered immediately. But she did not volunteer alone. She gathered her crew and told them exactly what the mission would mean. She told them they would likely die. She told them there would be no rescue. She told them to think carefully before deciding. The old commander's voice cracked slightly. Every single member of her crew stepped forward. 111 humans looked at their captain and chose to die beside her. A murmur ran through the assembly hall. The cadets looked at each other with expressions of disbelief. Such a thing was unheard of among coalition species. No commander would ask their crew to die. No crew would agree to such a request. I was serving on a carrier nearby when the valiant sun departed. I watched them go into the asteroid field. I listened to their communications, and I have never forgotten what I heard. The hologram began playing audio recordings, translated into common galactic language, but preserving the original human voices underneath. Captain Grant's voice came first, calm and steady. "All hands, this is the captain. We are beginning our approach. Remember what we trained for. Remember why we're here. And remember that whatever happens, we do this together." Then came other voices. The chief engineer, a man named Marcus Bell, reporting that the engines were running at full power. The navigation officer, Kim Tran, calling out course corrections as they weaved through the spinning rocks. Weapons officers and damage control teams and ordinary crew members, all speaking in calm professional tones as they flew toward certain death. Crickstall let the recordings play for several minutes. The cadets listened in absolute silence as the valiant sun pushed deeper into the asteroid field. They heard the crew report damage from rock impacts. They heard wounded people refusing to leave their posts. They heard Captain Grant encouraging her people with quiet words of pride and love. Then came the moment that haunted Crickstall's dreams. That Marcus Bell's voice crackled through static. "Captain, the reactor is failing. We've taken too much damage. We have maybe 10 minutes of power left." Kim Tran responded immediately. "I have visual on the target. Distance is 12 kilometers and closing." There was a pause. Then Captain Grant spoke, and her voice was the calmest thing Crickstall had ever heard. "All hands, this is the captain. It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve with you. Now let's finish what we started. Helm, running speed." The recording ended with the sound of the valiant sun's engines roaring to full power. Then silence. Crickstall turned off the hologram and faced his audience. Many of the cadets had tears streaming down their faces, or whatever their species used instead of tears. Some were trembling. A few looked like they might be sick. "The Drexar command vessel was destroyed," Crickstall said quietly. "The valiant sun struck it at full speed. The explosion was visible from ships thousands of kilometers away. 112 lives ended in a single moment of fire." He walked slowly across the stage. Coalition Command called it a strategic victory. The death of the command ship threw the Drexar into chaos for months. Our forces were able to regroup and launch counterattacks. Many historians believe it was the turning point of the entire war. The old warrior stopped and turned to face his audience. "I have studied military history across 43 species. I have read accounts of battles going back thousands of years. And in all that time, I have found only one species that has a word for what the valiant sun did." He spoke the word slowly, carefully, giving each syllable its proper weight. "Sacrifice. Humans call it sacrifice. The willing choice to give your life so that others might live." A Volante cadet raised a trembling appendage. "Commander, surely other species have similar concepts. Parents protecting children. Soldiers dying for their homelands. These are common across the galaxy." "Yes," Crickstall agreed. "But there is a difference. Among other species, such deaths are tragedies. They are mourned as losses. We build memorials to remind ourselves of the cost of war." He pointed at the empty space where the hologram had been. "Humans build memorials too, but they also celebrate these deaths. They tell stories about them to their children. They name ships and buildings after the fallen. They treat sacrifice not as a tragedy, but as the highest form of heroism. The old commander's voice grew soft. I asked a human scholar once to explain this to me. She told me that humans believe there is no greater love than to give your life for your friends. She said that every human who chooses to die for others becomes eternal. Their name lives forever. Their example inspires others to be brave. Crickstow shook his head slowly. I still do not fully understand this belief. Among my people, a dead warrior cannot fight again. A dead life cannot create new life. Death is always a loss, never a gain. He looked out at the young faces before him. But humans see it differently. To them, a life given willingly for others has infinite value. It is worth more than victory. It is worth more than survival. It is the purest expression of everything they believe. The assembly hall was so quiet that Crickstow could hear the cadets breathing. Captain, Louise Grant and the crew of the Valiant Sun are remembered as heroes by humanity. Their names are taught in every human school. Their story is told whenever humans gather to honor their warriors. They did not die in defeat. They died in triumph, and their triumph echoes through the generations. Crickstow straightened his old body and gave the formal salute of his people to the empty air where the hologram had shown the Valiant. Son, I never met Captain Grant, but I honor her memory. I honor all of them, because they showed me what humans are willing to pay for victory, and it is a price that no other species would even consider. Commander Crickstow stood in silence for a long moment. His old body ached from standing so long, but he barely noticed. The memories he had shared weighed on him far more than physical pain ever could. The cadets waited, sensing that he had not yet finished. They were right. The frontier wars ended 30 years ago, Crickstow finally said. The Drexar horde was broken. Their homeworlds were occupied. Their military was disbanded. Peace came to the galaxy, and with it came a new era. The hologram activated one final time, showing scenes from modern galactic life. Human traders laughing with alien merchants in busy spaceports. Human diplomats sitting on the Galactic Council beside representatives from 100 species. Human families raising children on colony worlds, playing games and building homes and living ordinary lives. Look at them, Crickstow said softly. Look at what humanity has become. They are artists and scientists. They are teachers and builders. They create music that makes other species weep with joy. They tell stories that spread across the galaxy. They are our partners, our friends, our allies. He let the peaceful images play for several minutes. The cadets watched humans helping others, healing others, working beside others. There was no sign of the warriors Crickstow had described. These were gentle people, kind people, the sort of beings anyone would want as neighbors. It would be easy to forget, Crickstow continued. It would be easy to look at these smiling faces and believe that the stories I have told you are exaggerations. Ancient history from a war that ended before most of you were born. Easy to believe that humans have changed, that they have become soft, that they are no longer capable of the things I have described. The old commander's voice hardened. Do not make this mistake. He turned off the hologram and walked to the very edge of the stage, bringing himself as close to his audience as possible. I visited Earth 3 years ago. I wanted to see the human homeworld for myself. I walked their cities and traveled their wilderness. I met ordinary humans living ordinary lives. And I saw something that confirmed everything I had learned during the war. Crickstow paused to gather his thoughts. In every human city, there are memorials, statues of warriors, walls covered with names of the dead, museums filled with weapons and uniforms and flags stained with blood. Humans do not hide their violent history. They display it proudly. They teach it to their children. They remember every battle, every war, every sacrifice. He looked out at the young officers. I asked the human child, perhaps 10 years old, why these memorials were so important. She told me that her people never wanted to forget what they were capable of. She said they kept these memories alive so they would always be ready. The assembly hall felt colder somehow. The cadets sat perfectly still. Ready for what? I asked her. And this child, this innocent young being, looked at me with eyes far too wise for her age. She said they were ready for anyone who threatened the things they loved, anyone who hurt their families, anyone who tried to take their freedom. Quickstyle made a sound that was his species' version of a sigh. She was 10 years old, and she already understood what I had spent decades learning. Humans carry both natures within them, always. The gentle friend, the terrible warrior. They can switch between these natures in a heartbeat when necessary. He began pacing slowly across the stage. After the war, I stayed in contact with Amy Shaw. We became friends, as much as two such different beings can be friends. I visited her on Earth many times. We talked about the war, about peace, about the future of our peoples. The old commander stopped pacing and faced his audience. On my last visit, 2 years ago, I asked her a question that had been bothering me since the siege of Sigma 7. I asked her how she had found the strength to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. How she had kept her soldiers motivated through 43 days of horror. His voice grew quiet. She smiled at me. That same gentle smile I remembered from the command center all those years ago. And she told me something I will remember until the day I die. The cadets leaned forward, desperate to hear. She said that humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other. Every weapon they had ever built, every tactic they had ever developed, every strategy they had ever created, all of it had been tested against the most dangerous opponent in the galaxy, themselves. Crick still let those words hang in the air. Think about what that means. Every other species in the coalition developed their military to fight external threats. We trained to defeat enemies who were different from us. Aliens with different bodies, different minds, different ways of thinking. He raised a manipulator arm and pointed at the cadets. Humans trained to fight beings exactly like themselves. Beings with the same creativity, the same determination, the same capacity for both kindness and cruelty. For thousands of years, they sharpened their skills against the most challenging opponent possible. The old warrior began walking toward the exit, his lecture nearly complete. The Drexar were fierce. They were brutal. They conquered dozens of worlds before they met humanity. But Amy Shaw told me something that explains why they ultimately lost. He stopped at the door and turned back one final time. She said the Drexar were simply not as frightening as what humanity had already survived. They were not as clever as human generals. They were not as ruthless as human tyrants. They were not as creative as human warriors. Everything the Drexar could throw at humanity, humans had already seen before. From their own kind. Commander Crickstaw straightened his body and looked at each cadet in turn. You are young. You will have long careers ahead of you. You will serve the coalition in peacetime and perhaps in war. And someday, you may find yourself standing beside humans or facing them across a battlefield. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. If you stand beside them, there is no better ally in the galaxy. They will fight for you. They will die for you. They will sacrifice everything to protect those they consider friends. The old warrior paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of absolute certainty. But if you stand against them, remember everything I have told you today. Remember Sigma 7. Remember Call Done. Remember the valiant sun. Remember that humans do not fight like other species. They do not calculate acceptable losses. They do not surrender when the odds turn against them. He placed one manipulator arm on the door frame. They fight like they have everything to lose and nothing left to fear. And that, young ones, is the most terrifying thing in the universe. Quickstyle pressed a button and the door slid open. Bright light from the hallway spilled into the darkened assembly hall. He paused in the doorway and spoke his final words. If the Galactic Coalition is wise, we will never give humanity a reason to fight us. We will keep them as friends and partners and allies. We will remember what they did in the frontier wars and be grateful they did it for us, not against us. He began to walk through the door, then stopped. But if that day ever comes, if some foolish generation forgets the lessons of the past and threatens what humans love, then heaven help us all. Because I've seen what happens when humanity goes to war. And I promise you, that is not something any species should face willingly. The old commander disappeared through the doorway, leaving the cadets alone in the darkened hall. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They sat in silence, thinking about everything they had heard. Outside the academy, the sun was setting over Velthos Prime. In spaceports across the planet, human traders were closing their shops and heading home for dinner. Human families were tucking their children into bed. Human musicians were playing songs that made alien audiences cry. They looked so peaceful, so gentle, so harmless. But in the assembly hall of the War Academy, 100 young cadets had learned a truth they would never forget. Humanity was all of those things. And humanity was also something else. Something ancient and dark and infinitely patient. Something that slept quietly, waiting for the day it might be needed again. And when that day came, the galaxy would remember why humans were feared.